All right, guys, welcome to the option education module. I'm super excited to bring this 11-step guide video by video, essentially showing bare basics, what is an option, fundamentals of an option, right? Why they exist, moving into the Greeks and understanding how options move and the derivatives of them, understanding kind of implementing strategies, why I'm taking trades the way I do, why I'm taking, calls over puts, right? Stuff like that. And finally, the risk associated and how to properly apply them. So without further ado, we're going to be getting into kind of the first video here, which are what are options, right? So options are essentially a contract with rights. So we're going to talk about buying options first because you can be a buyer and you can also be a seller, right? So when I'm saying buying a call, right, there are calls and puts, right? So we're going to go on SPY. Just so we can take a look at the options, right? So SPY is an ETF, as we know, and it trades at $663 as of today. If I go to trade options, you'll see buy, sell, call, put, right? And I mentioned that these have rights associated with them, right? So I'm talking about buying a call. The call by nature allows us to buy shares of stock at a strike price, okay? So for instance, if I'm buying a call for, and we are going to have to go here. If I'm buying a call for, say, 665, this is essentially saying that as the call buyer, I have the right to exercise my need to buy 100 shares at 665, right? Because this is the strike price and I'm buying this contract, right? And you would have caught that I said 100 shares, okay? It's important to note that calls and puts, all options trade in 100 share increments, right? So if I go to, buy this call, this is listed per share. So you can see that if I press continue here, the estimated cost is $70 with $100 or 100 times multiplier, right? So options represent 100 shares, right? So if I buy the 665, it gives me the right to buy 100 shares at that strike price, okay? Now, why would I want to do that, right? Why would I want to buy, 100 shares at 665? It doesn't make sense in this ideology, in this framework right here, because the share price is at 663. It's cheaper, right? So this is what we call out of the money. These calls above the share price currently are out of the money. And what that means is it doesn't make sense to exercise them because you could be buying the shares at a cheaper price, right? It's only in the money options, which are those below the share price, that actually have intrinsic value to be exercised, right? So for instance, if I was going to buy the 660, it would then make sense to exercise it potentially because I could buy shares at 660 instead of 663, okay? That essentially is a call in nature. People can buy in the money calls and out of the money calls, right? And you'll see that these are very, very cheap, while these are very, very expensive, right? Because again, these are 100 multipliers. So if I was going to click on the 660, you can see that it is going to be $416 to purchase this call. And this begs the question, why, right? We said these have intrinsic value, right? Because for every dollar the strike is under the share price, we can essentially be buying those 100 shares for less and less, right? So in order for that to essentially be equated in the market price of the options, they need to move by $100 increments or dollar increments per share, right? So I know it's a little confusing, but you can see that every dollar we go down, since we can buy SPY at a cheaper price, we're compensated by paying a dollar because it's intrinsically valuable. While here, it's all about the time, right? It's all about, okay, do I think that SPY can go above this strike price? You're paying for that lottery ticket, right? If that makes sense. You're only paying $22 because SPY has to get above that. It's risky, right? When these are already in the money and have value because it makes sense to buy at this price, okay? Hopefully that makes sense, but essentially buying a call gives you the right and not the obligation to buy 100 shares at that strike price, right? out of the money because it doesn't make sense to exercise here, in the money. Okay, let's move on to puts. Puts are essentially the opposite. They are a bearish strategy. Okay, so if I am buying puts, I am bearish on the underlying stock or ETF in this case. Now the share price is 663, and what a put is it gives you the right, again, not the obligation, the right to sell your shares at the strike price, right? So for instance, if I was going to buy a put for 665, right, it again would cost me $200 because it's in $100 multipliers. And what this is saying is I can now sell my 100 shares of stock at this strike price, which makes sense because the share price is lower than the strike price. Thus, the in the money options and the out of the money options flip when you go from calls to puts. These are now in the money, right? Because it makes sense to sell these shares at a higher price, a higher strike price, which is why they're more expensive options. And down here, they are less expensive because it doesn't make sense to sell your shares at 660. It makes sense to sell them at the market price now, right? So these are now out of the money puts, in the money puts, right? Now let's go back to our foundations. So we've already explained calls and puts. We already explained the strike price, which is essentially the price at which, in the puts case, you are going to be selling your shares at if you're a buyer. And for calls, it's what you can buy the shares at, right? So we explained that. Now let's explain expiration date, okay? So as I mentioned before, buying calls and buying puts allows you to either buy or sell shares at that price, right? Well, these contracts, right? All options are contracts, come in different dates till expiration, right? Because not all contracts are good until perpetuity or into perpetuity, right? They're not good forever. They have a certain lifespan, right? And they can go all the way from 1 day to almost 900 days out, almost a couple years out, right? And people want to buy calls and puts for different expirations for different reasons, right? And inherently, if you think about it, one, just like being the time value of money, that sort of theory, people want to, speculate and buy these far, far dated calls and puts because they want time on their side for whatever reason, right? And think about it. If I was going to buy a call, right? So I want to essentially have the right to purchase shares at the strike price, right? If I was going to buy a out of the money call, that means that I'm bullish, right? I need the shares, the stock to move, right? Of say 670, right? This is only going to cost me $4 because it doesn't make sense to buy something that needs to move so far in only a 3-day span, right? Nobody wants to buy it. There's no bid, right? Because it doesn't make sense to take on the risk for SPY needing to go up $7. However, if we go out to say, we'll go out to January 27. You can see that these calls are now way more expensive because SPY not only goes up over time, as we've seen, but it also gives it a lot of time to go up, right? So now if I'm looking at even the $700 calls, they're going for $4,000, right? Because people are saying, hey, I think SPY is going to go up, so thus I can make money. It's essentially a bet on the stock to go up, which is why it's more expensive when you have more time. More time on your side is more expensive, right? This is called extrinsic value, okay? Extrinsic value is time, right? So when you have more time, the contract is going to cost more because there's more that can happen and risk needs to be compensated, risk of the stock moving any which direction, right? And if that's, that being said, if I go out to the next year, they're going to be even more expensive, right? Because there's more time on the contract, right? If we go down to the 0 date to expiration, so this already expired today, right? You can see that these have no more time on them, right? You see they're going for pennies right now because there's no more time for the stock to move today. But you can see here, this is all intrinsic value because as you can see, we can now buy shares because we're buying calls. We can buy these shares at 659, right? So these have premiums to them still. And when I say premium, because that is the next kind of structure in the foundations, premium, when I say premium, that is just what you are paying for the option. Super simple. So you can see the 664 is a premium of $184. Okay? That's all it is. Premium is how much you're paying for the option. Why options exist, we kind of went over this, and it's the fact that either people can say, hey, I want to be able to buy shares here and I'm going to pay for this contract, or I want to sell shares here and I am willing to pay for the contract. Now, for instance, if I'm buying puts, right, I'm bearish, or at least I want to hedge maybe my existing shares, right? So options can be used as a hedge. If I am going to buy a put for say 40 days out because I expect, some news to be bearish, and that's just, I don't want to sell my stock, but I just want to have an insurance policy, right? Well, I can, pay $900 to be able to sell shares at 660 because maybe I'm thinking that the share price of SPY is going to go down to 620, right? So it makes sense to buy this because if it goes down to 620, I'll be at a profit on the option hedging my existing shares. Which, again, insurance policy, right? Now, again, pros and cons, right? Having these contracts, right? As we said, puts and calls. Calls being bullish, puts being bearish. When they finish their life cycle, right? So 42 days this contract has, 13 days this contract has. As they get to the end of their life cycle, that time value erodes, right? So there is the inherent risk that these options do not finish in the money. They finish out of the money, right? Which again, shown here, 3 days, these can become incredibly cheap because nobody wants them, right? So that's the inherent risk when buying options. So now that we've covered pretty much everything in video 1, we're going to move to video 2, which is option contracts and pricing, and we'll be going over this shortly. We'll see you then.